I asked what time my son's funeral would be. My daughter-in-law didn't even look up from her phone. He's been gone for hours, she said, with a small, careless smirk. That was how I learned my only child had already been buried. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Sometimes it helps to know how far pain and truth can travel. The hallway outside the hospital room smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. The kind of smell that clings to places where people wait too long for news they don't want to hear. I had been sitting in that narrow plastic chair since just after sunrise. My purse rested on my lap. My hands stayed folded over it the way my late husband used to tell me to do when I was nervous. Keep your hands still, Margaret, he'd say with a gentle smile. If your hands stay calm, your heart will follow. But my heart wasn't calm that morning. At 72, you learn to recognize certain silences. The kind doctors carry in their eyes. The kind nurses avoid with careful politeness. My son Daniel had been rushed into surgery just after midnight. A heart attack, they said. Sudden. Severe. I kept replaying the last thing he told me 2 nights earlier over the phone. Mom, I'll come by Sunday. I'll bring the grandkids. You can make that pot roast Dad used to love. He always remembered that meal. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, slow-cooked for 6 hours until the whole house smelled like home. I had already bought the ingredients. They were still sitting in my refrigerator. Daniel was 46 years old. When you have a child that late in life, you always imagine you'll be the one to go first. You prepare yourself for that quiet, inevitable order of things. You never imagine sitting alone in a hospital corridor, waiting to hear whether your child will survive the night. The clock above the nurse's station ticked louder with every minute. 8:12 a.m., 8:37 a.m., 9:05 a.m. People walked past me constantly. Doctors in white coats. Families clutching paper coffee cups. A young woman crying softly into her husband's shoulder. But no one came to speak to me. Not once. Around 10 o'clock, I finally stood up and approached the nurse's desk. My knees felt stiff, the way they always did when I'd been sitting too long. Excuse me, I said gently. The young nurse looked up from her computer. Yes, ma'am. My son, Daniel Whitaker. He was in surgery last night. I was wondering if there's been any update. Her fingers paused over the keyboard. For a moment, something passed across her face. Confusion. Then something else. Pity. Oh, she said quietly. Just that one word. Oh. The kind of word that sinks straight into your stomach before your mind even understands why. I'm sorry, she added. I thought someone had already spoken with you. My chest tightened. Spoken with me about what? The nurse hesitated, glancing toward a hallway behind her. Then she lowered her voice. Your daughter-in-law handled everything early this morning. Handled. Such a strange word. Handled what? I asked. But the nurse was already shifting uncomfortably. You should probably speak with her, she said carefully. She left a few hours ago. Left. A few hours ago. I stared at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence. It never came. The walk from the hospital to the parking lot felt longer than it should have. The Texas sun had already climbed high enough to warm the pavement. I sat in my old silver Buick for a long time before starting the engine. My hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. Not from grief. Not yet. From confusion. Something about the nurse's words didn't make sense. Daniel wouldn't leave the hospital without calling me. He never had. Even after he married Rebecca. Even after things between us became complicated. He always called. Rebecca had been my daughter-in-law for 13 years. She was a beautiful woman. Tall. Stylish. Always perfectly composed. The kind of woman who walked into a room and made everyone feel slightly underdressed. Daniel adored her. I tried to too. For his sake. But over the years, I noticed small things. Tiny shifts in the way she spoke to me. Little comments that sounded polite, but carried a quiet edge. Margaret, you really shouldn't worry about these things anymore. Let Daniel and me handle the decisions. Or, you must be exhausted living alone in that big house. She always smiled when she said things like that. A perfectly pleasant smile. The kind that made you question whether you were imagining the insult. Daniel never seemed to notice. Or maybe he didn't want to. By the time I reached their house, it was nearly noon. The same white colonial Daniel had bought 8 years earlier. I remembered the day he showed it to me. Plenty of space for the kids, he'd said proudly. And for Sunday dinners. But Sunday dinners had slowly disappeared. First because the children had soccer practice. Then because Rebecca preferred brunch with her friends. Then because everyone was simply too busy. I parked at the curb and walked up the front path. The oak tree Daniel planted when his youngest daughter was born had grown tall enough to shade the porch. I reached the front door. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I knocked. Rebecca opened the door almost immediately. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse and dark sunglasses. Her hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place. She looked calm. Too calm. "Oh," she said when she saw me. No surprise. No concern. Just mild inconvenience. "Margaret." I searched her face. "Rebecca," I said softly. "I just came from the hospital." She leaned against the doorframe. "Yes." That was all. Yes. A single word. My throat tightened. I asked the nurse about Daniel. I continued carefully. Rebecca slipped her sunglasses onto the top of her head. Then she sighed. The way someone sighs when a conversation is about to become tedious. "You really should have called first," she said. "Called." My hands tightened around my purse strap. "I've been at the hospital all night," I replied quietly. "I know," she said. She knew. Of course she knew. "So," I asked gently, "what time is Daniel's funeral?" Rebecca's lips curled slightly. Not quite a smile. More like amusement. Then she said the sentence that would echo in my mind for the rest of my life. "He's been gone for hours." For a moment, the world went completely silent. I stared at her. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "What did you say?" Rebecca folded her arms. "We had the service early this morning," she said. Her voice was calm, practical, almost bored. "The burial is already done." The words didn't feel real. "Done?" "Yes." My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. "You buried my son," I said slowly. "And you didn't tell me?" Rebecca shrugged. "It was a small family service." Small. Family. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. "I'm his mother," I said. For the first time, something sharp flickered in her eyes. "Yes," she said. "But you weren't really part of Daniel's life anymore, were you?" The porch felt suddenly too bright. Too hot. Behind Rebecca, I could see the living room. Daniel's favorite armchair still sat by the window. His coffee mug rested on the side table. Everything looked exactly the same. Except my son was already in the ground. And I had never even been told he was gone. That was the moment I realized something was terribly wrong. Not just with Rebecca, but with everything surrounding my son's death. Rebecca stood there like the conversation was already over. Like she had just told me the weather. For a moment, I couldn't move. My fingers were still wrapped around the strap of my purse, and I noticed how tightly I was holding it. My knuckles had turned pale. "You had the funeral this morning?" I asked quietly. "Yes." "And no one called me?" Rebecca tilted her head slightly, the way people do when they're trying to appear patient with someone slow. "It all happened very quickly," she said. "Daniel's condition deteriorated overnight. The hospital released the body early, and the funeral home had an opening this morning." Her voice was calm, organized, efficient, like she was explaining a change in a dinner reservation. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "I was in the hospital," I said slowly. "I sat in that hallway for hours." Rebecca shrugged. "Well, no one told me that." The sentence landed heavier than it should have. No one told me. Not I didn't know. Not I'm sorry. Just a quiet excuse. Behind her, I could hear movement in the house. A television playing softly somewhere in the living room. One of the grandchildren laughing in the distance. Life continuing. As if my son hadn't just been lowered into the ground a few hours earlier. "Who was there?" I asked. Rebecca crossed her arms again. "Immediate family." The words echoed strangely. "Immediate family." I swallowed. "Daniel's sister lives in Arizona," I said. "His father passed 10 years ago." Rebecca looked at me without blinking. "Yes." The silence stretched between us. "Then who exactly?" I asked. "Did you consider immediate family?" She didn't hesitate. "My parents were there. My brother flew in. Last night. And of course the children. Her parents. Her brother. But not me." The realization didn't hit like an explosion. It came slowly, quietly, like a door closing somewhere deep inside my chest. "I see," I said. Rebecca nodded once, as if the matter had now been clarified. Then she glanced at her watch. "We're actually having a small gathering later this afternoon," she added. "Friends, neighbors, people from Daniel's office." Her tone suggested she was doing me a favor by mentioning it. "You're welcome to stop by if you want." If I want. I stood there looking at the woman who had shared my son's life for 13 years. And for the first time, I realized something I should have understood a long time ago. Rebecca wasn't grieving. Rebecca was managing a situation. And somehow, I had been removed from it entirely. Rebecca stepped aside just enough for me to see inside the house. For a second, I thought about walking past her, about stepping into my son's home the way I had done so many times before, carrying a pie, or a casserole, or a birthday gift for the children. But something about the way she stood there stopped me. Her body blocked the doorway without looking like it was blocking anything at all. Subtle, polite, final. I think I'll come back later, I said. Rebecca gave a small nod, already half distracted. All right, she replied. Just let me know first, so we're prepared. Prepared. As if my presence required scheduling. I turned and walked back down the porch steps slowly, careful with my knees the way my doctor always reminded me. The oak tree rustled softly above the driveway. The same tree Daniel planted with his own hands 8 years ago. I remembered that afternoon clearly. He had been kneeling in the dirt, his youngest daughter holding the little plastic watering can. Mom, he had said, smiling up at me, this tree's going to be here longer than all of us. I slid into the driver's seat of my Buick and closed the door. The car felt very quiet. Too quiet. For a long moment, I didn't start the engine. I just sat there. My mind replayed Rebecca's words again. He's been gone for hours. The funeral had already happened. My son had already been buried. And somehow, in the middle of all that, no one thought to call me. At 72, you start to notice patterns in people. Little decisions that reveal more than words ever do. Rebecca hadn't looked surprised when she saw me. She hadn't looked sad either. What she looked like was inconvenienced. That thought stayed with me as I drove away from the house. Halfway down the street, my phone buzzed in my purse. A text message from an unfamiliar number. I pulled the car to the curb and opened it. The message was short. Mrs. Whitaker, this is Paul from Daniel's office. I'm so sorry for your loss. I tried calling earlier, but Rebecca said the family had already handled everything. I read the message twice. Then a third time. Handled everything. The same words the nurse had used. My stomach tightened, because suddenly, something about this morning didn't feel like a tragedy anymore. It felt organized, planned, and for the first time since the hospital hallway, a quiet question formed in my mind. Why would someone rush to bury a man before his own mother even knew he was dead? I didn't drive home right away. Instead, I pulled into a small parking lot across from a quiet park a few blocks away. It was the kind of park Daniel used to bring the kids to on Saturday mornings. I had watched them there once, him pushing his youngest on the swing while the older one chased pigeons across the grass. I sat in my car with the engine off. The text message from Paul was still open on my phone. Rebecca said the family had already handled everything. Handled everything. Those same words again. I looked out through the windshield. A man was walking his dog along the sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn mower hummed steadily. Normal life. Normal sounds. The world had not stopped because my son had died. But something inside my chest still felt frozen. I tried to picture the funeral that had happened only hours earlier. Daniel's coffin. The small chapel. The quiet music they usually play at services like that. Had anyone said his favorite Bible verse? The one he read at his father's memorial? Had someone talked about the way he used to laugh so loudly that people across the room would turn and smile? Or the way he always fixed things for neighbors? Broken fences, leaking faucets, squeaky doors? I wasn't there to know. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. For 46 years, Daniel had been the center of my world. I was there the day he took his first steps across our living room carpet. I was there the night he stayed up crying because he thought monsters lived in his closet. I was there when he walked across the stage to receive his college diploma. But somehow, I was not there when they buried him. A strange calm began to settle over me then. Not peace. Something colder. Because grief usually comes with tears. But what I was feeling now was something different. Confusion. And beneath that confusion, a quiet unease that kept growing the more I thought about the morning. Rebecca had organized a funeral within hours. She had told people the family had handled everything. And yet the one person who had been Daniel's family the longest had never been told. I opened my purse slowly and pulled out the small notebook I kept there. It was the same notebook where I wrote grocery lists and doctor appointments. My pen hovered over the first blank page. Then I wrote 3 simple questions. What time did Daniel die? Who authorized the burial? And why was his own mother left out of it? I stared at those questions for a long time. Because deep down, I already knew something important. Funerals don't happen this quickly by accident. Someone had made sure everything moved fast. Too fast. I sat there in that parking lot longer than I expected. The notebook rested on my lap, the 3 questions staring back at me. At my age, you learn something important about problems. If something feels wrong, it usually is. I closed the notebook and placed it back inside my purse. Then I started the car. There was only one place I could go next. The hospital. The lobby looked exactly the same as it had that morning. People coming and going. Phones ringing behind the reception desk. A volunteer in a blue vest offering directions to visitors. It felt strange walking back into the same building where my son had died only hours earlier. But this time, I wasn't here to wait. I was here to ask questions. The same young nurse was still at the desk when I approached. She recognized me immediately. "Oh, Mrs. Whitaker," she said softly. "Yes," I replied. I kept my voice calm. "I was here earlier about my son, Daniel." Her expression changed again. The same mixture of sympathy and uncertainty I had seen before. "I remember," she said. "I just have a few questions," I continued. "If that's all right." She nodded quickly. "Of course." I leaned slightly closer to the counter. "What time did Daniel pass away?" She turned to her computer and typed for a moment. The quiet tapping of the keyboard echoed between us. Then she looked back up. According to the record, 6:42 a.m. 6:42. I thought about the hallway chair where I had been sitting. At 6:42 that morning, I was only 30 feet away from the operating room doors. Waiting, still believing someone would come out and talk to me. Was I notified? I asked. The nurse hesitated. "No," she said carefully. "The next of kin was notified." "Rebecca." "Yes." I nodded slowly. That part made sense. A wife is usually listed as next of kin, but the next question was the one that mattered. "And the funeral home?" I asked. "How quickly was the body released?" The nurse frowned slightly as she checked the screen again. "Well, that's unusual." "Unusual how?" She turned the monitor slightly so she could read the notes more clearly. "The release authorization was submitted very quickly," she said. "How quickly?" She glanced back at me. 40 minutes after the time of death. 40 minutes. I felt the air leave my lungs slowly. "That's very fast," she added. "Most families need hours. Sometimes a full day. Paperwork. Arrangements. Time to call relatives." But Rebecca had authorized everything within 40 minutes. Before I even knew my son was gone. The nurse studied my face for a moment. "Mrs. Whitaker, were you able to attend this service?" I shook my head once. "No," I said quietly. Then I thanked her and walked back toward the exit. But as the automatic doors opened and the warm afternoon air hit my face, one thought kept repeating in my mind. Rebecca didn't just rush the funeral. She rushed it before anyone could ask questions. The hospital doors closed behind me with a soft hiss. For a moment, I just stood there on the sidewalk. Cars moved slowly through the parking lot. A helicopter passed somewhere far above the city. Life continued the way it always does, even when someone's entire world has just shifted. I walked to my car and sat down again. This time, I didn't start the engine right away. Instead, I opened my purse and took out the notebook again. The 3 questions I had written earlier stared back at me. Now I added a 4th. Why rush the funeral in 40 minutes? My pen lingered on the page. Because there are only a few reasons someone moves that quickly after a death. Shock, panic, or something they don't want anyone else to see. I closed the notebook slowly. Then another memory surfaced. Something small. Something I hadn't thought about in months. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had come to my house on a Sunday afternoon. He arrived alone. No Rebecca. No children. That alone had been unusual. Daniel rarely went anywhere without telling her. But that day, he sat at my kitchen table for almost 2 hours. We drank coffee. The same old ceramic mugs I had used for 30 years. And he kept rubbing the back of his neck the way he did when something was bothering him. "Mom," he said eventually, "have you ever gotten the feeling that something in your life isn't quite right?" I remember laughing softly at the time. "That's called getting older, sweetheart," I told him. But he didn't laugh. Instead, he stared down into his coffee. "Rebecca's been handling most of the financial stuff lately," he said carefully. "Bills, accounts, insurance things. That's normal in a marriage," I replied. "Yes," he said. Then he paused. "But I tried to log into one of the accounts last week, and the password had been changed." I looked at him across the table. "Did you ask her about it?" "I did." "And?" Daniel gave a small shrug. "She said I must have forgotten the new one." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Married couples argue about small things all the time. Passwords, bills, credit cards. But now, sitting alone in my car outside the hospital, that conversation felt different. He had come to me because something felt wrong. And 3 weeks later, my son was dead, buried before noon. And his wife had made sure everything happened before I even knew. I looked down at the notebook again. Slowly, I added one more line beneath the others. What was Daniel trying to tell me 3 weeks ago? Because something deep inside me was beginning to understand a very uncomfortable possibility. Maybe Rebecca hadn't rushed the funeral because she was grieving. Maybe she rushed it because my son had discovered something. And whatever Daniel discovered, he never had the chance to explain it. I drove home slowly. The afternoon traffic had started to build, and every red light seemed longer than usual. But I didn't mind. My thoughts were moving slower than the cars anyway. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. White shutters. The small flower bed near the porch. The wind chime Daniel had bought me 10 years ago when he took a trip to Colorado. It chimed softly as I opened the front door. Inside, the house felt still. Too still. I set my purse on the kitchen table and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were steadier now. The shaking from earlier had faded, replaced by something quieter. Focus. Grief can make people fall apart. But sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes it sharpens things. I opened my purse again and took out the notebook. The list of questions had grown. What time did Daniel die? Who authorized the burial? Why was his own mother left out? Why rush the funeral? What was Daniel trying to tell me 3 weeks ago? I stared at those questions for a moment. Then my phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar again. For a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something told me not to. Hello. Mrs. Whitaker, a man's voice said. Yes. This is Mark Feldman. I'm Daniel's attorney. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. Daniel's attorney? I repeated. Yes. I tried calling Rebecca earlier today, but she didn't return my call. I was hoping to speak with Daniel about some paperwork he asked me to prepare last week. Paperwork. My fingers tightened around the phone. I'm afraid you haven't heard, I said quietly. He passed away this morning. The silence on the other end lasted longer than it should have. I see, the lawyer said eventually. His voice had changed. Not shocked. Concerned. That's unexpected, he added. My stomach tightened again. Unexpected how? Well, he said carefully. Daniel came to my office 3 days ago. 3 days. Only 3 days before he died. He asked me to begin reviewing several of his financial accounts. The lawyer continued. For what reason? I asked. He was considering making some changes. Changes to what? There was another pause. Then the lawyer said something that made the quiet kitchen suddenly feel colder. To his beneficiary designations. Beneficiaries. Insurance. Accounts. I thought about the conversation Daniel and I had at my kitchen table 3 weeks earlier. Passwords changing. Accounts he couldn't access. And suddenly, another thought formed in my mind. Mr. Feldman, I said slowly. Yes. Did Daniel tell you why he wanted those changes? The lawyer hesitated. Then he answered. He said he had recently discovered something concerning about his finances. I closed my eyes for a moment. Because now the picture was starting to form. Daniel had discovered something. He contacted a lawyer. 3 days later, he was dead, and his wife had rushed to bury him within hours. Before anyone could ask what he had found, I stayed on the phone with Daniel's lawyer for several minutes after that. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The quiet stretched across the line like both of us were trying to put the same pieces together. Mrs. Whitaker, Mr. Feldman finally said, when was the last time you spoke with your son? 3 weeks ago, I replied. He came to my house. He seemed worried. That would make sense, the lawyer said. I leaned forward slightly. Why? There was a soft sound of papers shifting on his end of the line. Because during our meeting, he explained carefully, Daniel believed that a significant amount of money had been moved out of one of his accounts. My heart skipped. Moved where? That's the problem, he said. He couldn't find a clear record of where it went. I thought about what Daniel told me. The password change. The accounts he suddenly couldn't access. Was it a lot of money? I asked. The lawyer didn't hesitate. Enough that he felt it required immediate review. Immediate. That word stayed with me. Did he suspect anyone? I asked quietly. There was a pause. I can't say exactly what he suspected, Mr. Feldman replied. But he did mention that he hadn't personally managed those accounts for several months. Rebecca. The name didn't need to be spoken. My hand tightened around the phone. And the beneficiary changes? I asked. Yes. What kind of changes? Well, the lawyer said, Daniel told me he wanted to temporarily remove several names from his policies until the financial review was completed. Remove names. Plural. But we hadn't finalized the paperwork yet, he added. Your son planned to return later this week to sign everything. Later this week. My throat felt dry. But he never got that chance, I said softly. No, the lawyer replied. We both knew why. Because 3 days later, Daniel was gone. And his funeral had been completed before noon. Before anyone could ask questions. Before his attorney could even return his call. Mr. Feldman, I said slowly, are those policies still active? Yes, of course. And the beneficiaries? They would remain unchanged until the documents are signed. Unchanged. Which meant whoever was listed before was still listed now. I stared at the notebook on my kitchen table. The list of questions had grown longer with every hour. But suddenly, a new answer had appeared between the lines. Rebecca hadn't just rushed the funeral. She rushed it while the paperwork still favored her. Before Daniel could remove her name. Before anyone could see what he had discovered in those accounts. And for the first time since that morning, my grief stepped aside long enough for something colder to take its place. Because if Daniel died before he could change those documents, someone stood to gain a very large amount of money. And right now, only one person had made sure his burial happened before anyone started looking too closely. After the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The phone was still in my hand. Daniel's lawyer had just confirmed something important. 3 days before my son died, he had started changing things. Financial things. Important things. And now those changes would never happen. Because Daniel never made it back to the lawyer's office. I placed the phone down slowly. The kitchen felt different now. Not sad. Not quiet. Focused. Like a room where someone had just turned on a light. I opened the notebook again. The page was already crowded with questions, but I added another line beneath the others. Who benefits from Daniel's death today? It's not a pleasant question for a mother to write about her son. But at 72, I've learned something about truth. Truth doesn't care whether a question feels comfortable. Truth only cares whether someone is willing to ask it. I was still staring at the notebook when another memory surfaced. 2 years ago, Daniel had taken out a large life insurance policy. I remembered the conversation because he called me afterward. Mom, he had said jokingly, if anything ever happens to me, the kids will be taken care of. I told him I didn't like hearing things like that. No mother does. But he laughed it off. Relax, he said. I'm healthier than you. At the time, I didn't ask any details. I didn't ask the amount. I didn't ask the beneficiary. But now, sitting alone at my kitchen table, the answer to that last question seemed obvious. Rebecca, wives are almost always listed first, which meant something else. If Daniel had discovered money missing from his accounts, if he had gone to a lawyer to change beneficiaries, and if he died before those changes were signed, then the person who benefited the most from his death was still the same person who rushed his funeral. Rebecca, I leaned back slowly in my chair. Across the kitchen, the clock on the wall ticked softly. For 18 p.m. Rebecca had mentioned something earlier. A gathering at the house. Friends, neighbors, Daniel's co-workers, people stopping by to offer condolences. At the time, it sounded like a polite invitation. Now it sounded like something else. An opportunity. Because if Daniel had started asking questions about his finances, someone else might have noticed. Someone else might have heard something. And grief gatherings have a strange way of making people talk. I closed the notebook and stood up. For the first time that day, I walked upstairs and changed clothes. A simple black dress. The same one I wore to my husband's memorial 10 years ago. Then I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment. My eyes were tired. But they were clear. Because I wasn't going to Rebecca's house to grieve. I was going to listen. And sometimes, listening carefully is the first step to uncovering the truth. I arrived at Daniel's house just as the sun was beginning to lower behind the oak tree. Several cars were already parked along the street. More than I expected. People stood in small groups on the front lawn, speaking in quiet voices. A few neighbors held paper plates and plastic cups. Someone had brought a tray of food. The kind of gathering people arrange after a funeral. I parked a little farther down the street and sat in the car for a moment before getting out. Through the open front door, I could see movement inside the house. Rebecca was standing in the living room. She wore a black dress now. Her posture was perfect. Her face arranged in the same careful expression people use when they want to look appropriately sad. but something about it felt practiced. As I walked up the path, a few people noticed me. "Mrs. Whitaker," someone said softly. It was one of Daniel's neighbors, Mr. Carter. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I replied quietly. He looked a little surprised to see me, almost like he hadn't expected Daniel's mother to appear at her own son's memorial gathering. That feeling followed me as I stepped inside the house. The living room was crowded. Co-workers from Daniel's office. Neighbors. A few people I didn't recognize. But one thing was clear. Everyone here believed the funeral had already happened normally. No one looked like they knew his mother hadn't been told. Rebecca spotted me a few seconds later. For just a brief moment, something flashed across her face. Not grief. Shock. Then it disappeared. "Margaret," she said, walking toward me. Her voice lowered slightly. "I didn't think you were coming." "I changed my mind," I replied. She studied me carefully for a second, as if trying to measure something. Then she gave a polite smile and turned back to the room. "Everyone," she said gently, placing a hand over her chest. "This is Daniel's mother." Several people turned toward me. Sympathetic faces. Nods. A few murmured condolences. But as I stood there listening to them speak about my son, something else caught my attention. Two men standing near the dining room doorway were talking quietly. I recognized one of them. Paul, the man who had texted me earlier from Daniel's office. He hadn't noticed me yet. "I'm telling you, it didn't make sense," Paul was saying to the other man. "What didn't?" his friend asked. Paul lowered his voice even more. "The meeting this morning." My ears sharpened immediately. "What meeting?" the other man asked. "Daniel had scheduled a meeting with accounting today," Paul said. "About those missing transfers." My heart skipped. Missing transfers. The same words Daniel's lawyer had hinted at. But then Rebecca called the office at 7. Paul continued quietly. "What did she say?" "That Daniel passed away overnight, and that the meeting obviously wouldn't happen." The other man frowned. "Wait, 7? Yeah. But if he died overnight, why was there a meeting scheduled for this morning?" Paul shrugged uneasily. "That's exactly what I thought." I stood there very still. Because according to the hospital, Daniel died at 6:42 a.m., and Rebecca authorized the body release less than an hour later. But Daniel had still planned to attend a meeting about missing money that same morning, which meant something very important. My son didn't expect to die that day. Not at all. And suddenly, Rebecca's rushed funeral felt even less like grief, and much more like damage control. I stayed where I was, pretending to listen to the people offering condolences. But my attention remained on the conversation near the dining room doorway. Paul and the other man were still speaking quietly. Daniel sounded serious about it. Paul continued. "He asked accounting to pull the transaction records for the last 6 months. 6 months? The other man said. "Yeah. He thought something had been moved through one of the company accounts." My chest tightened. Company accounts. That meant this wasn't just a personal issue between Daniel and Rebecca anymore. This involved his business too. The other man lowered his voice. "So what happens now?" Paul shook his head. "I don't know. Rebecca called this morning and said Daniel had been under a lot of stress lately." Stress. I heard that word very clearly. She said the doctors believed the heart attack might have been caused by it. Stress. Such a convenient explanation. I turned slightly, finally letting Paul see me. His eyes widened immediately. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said softly. The other man turned too. "I'm sorry," Paul added quickly. "I didn't realize you were here." "That's all right," I replied calmly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Paul cleared his throat. "I was just telling Mark here about the meeting Daniel had scheduled today." "Yes," I said gently. "I heard." Paul looked uncomfortable. "I probably shouldn't speculate," he said. "Speculate about what?" He hesitated. Then he leaned a little closer. "Daniel believed someone had been moving money without his approval." The words hung in the air between us. "Did he know who?" I asked. Paul shook his head. "No." But he said only a small number of people had access to the account. "How small?" 3. My heart beat once, heavy and slow. "Daniel himself," Paul continued. "The company controller," he paused briefly. "And Rebecca." Silence settled over the three of us. Because Daniel's wife handled several of the company's financial records from home. She had helped him with bookkeeping for years. At the time, everyone thought it was practical. Now it sounded different. Much different. Paul rubbed the back of his neck. "The thing is," Daniel sounded determined, he said. "He told me yesterday afternoon that once the accountants pulled the records, he was going to confront whoever was responsible." Yesterday afternoon. Less than 24 hours before he died. Thank you for telling me that, I said quietly. Paul nodded. I just wish he had the chance to finish what he started. So did I? Because now the picture was clearer than it had been all day. My son had discovered money missing. He scheduled a meeting to investigate. He contacted a lawyer to change beneficiaries. And before any of those things could happen, he died suddenly. His funeral was rushed. And the one person who benefited the most from everything remaining unchanged was the same person standing across the room. Rebecca. I looked toward the living room. She was speaking with a group of neighbors now, dabbing carefully at the corner of her eye with a tissue. The perfect grieving widow. But for the first time since that morning, I wasn't looking at my son's wife anymore. I was looking at the only person who had both the opportunity and the reason to make sure Daniel never made it to that meeting. I stood in that living room for a long time. People continued talking around me. Quiet conversations. Soft music playing somewhere near the kitchen. The ordinary sounds of a morning gathering. But everything felt different now. Because grief and truth don't move at the same speed. Grief arrives first. Truth takes a little longer. I watched Rebecca across the room. She laughed softly at something one of the neighbors said. Then she lowered her head again, pressing a tissue gently to the corner of her eye. Anyone looking at her would see the same thing. A grieving widow. But I had lived 72 years. And long before today, I learned something important about people. Real grief is messy. Real grief forgets to fix its hair. Real grief doesn't look over its shoulder every few seconds to see who might be watching. Rebecca was performing. Carefully. Perfectly. And suddenly, I felt something settle inside my chest. Not anger. Not even revenge. Just clarity. My son was gone. Nothing I did now could change that. But the truth about what happened to him, that still mattered. I walked slowly across the room toward Rebecca. She noticed me halfway there. For the briefest moment, the calm expression on her face slipped. Only a second, but long enough. Margaret, she said quietly when I stopped in front of her. Yes, I replied. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she lowered her voice. I know today must be very difficult for you. I studied her face. Every detail. Every careful expression. Then I said something very simple. Rebecca, I spoke with Daniel's lawyer today. The color drained from her face so quickly it almost startled me. Just a flash. But enough. I see, she said slowly. He mentioned the meeting Daniel had planned this week. Rebecca said nothing. Across the room, the quiet conversations continued. No one else seemed to notice the silence growing between us. I also visited the hospital again, I added gently. They explained the timing of the paperwork. Rebecca's hand tightened slightly around the tissue she was holding. Still, she said nothing. That told me more than any answer could have. I looked at her for one final moment. Then I spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. You rushed everything today? I said. Too fast. Her eyes finally met mine. For the first time all afternoon, the mask slipped completely. And in that moment, I saw something that had nothing to do with grief. Fear. I straightened my shoulders. At my age, you stop worrying about being polite when something truly matters. My son didn't get the chance to finish what he started, I said calmly. But I will. Rebecca's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. And I didn't wait for them. I turned and walked toward the front door. Outside, the evening air felt cooler. The oak tree rustled gently above the driveway. Daniel planted that tree years ago. He once told me it would outlive all of us. Maybe he was right. But as I stood there under its branches, one thing became very clear. My son may have been buried that morning. But the truth about his death had only just begun to surface. And I wasn't going to let it be buried with him.